Ethan Carter sat slumped in the shadows of an alleyway behind a busy cafe, his body shielded from the brisk autumn wind by a battered army coat that had seen better days. The coat, once a proud emblem of his service, was now frayed at the edges, its original olive green faded to a dull, indistinguishable gray. Ethan's hands, calloused and cracked from years of exposure to the elements, cradled a small cup of coffee. The cup was warm against his palms, and the steam that rose from it was a rare comfort on this particularly cold afternoon. The coffee had been a gift from a stranger, a young woman who had spotted him sitting there, trying to stay out of sight. She hadn't said much, just smiled softly and handed him the drink before disappearing into the cafe. It wasn't much, but to Ethan, it felt like an act of grace. It wasn't often that people acknowledged him anymore. The city bustled around him, a cacophony of voices, car horns, and the clatter of hurried footsteps. Ethan had grown accustomed to the noise, just as he had grown accustomed to being overlooked. People passed him by as if he were part of the urban landscape, another shadow among many. It hadn't always been this way. Leaning back against the rough brick wall, Ethan allowed his thoughts to drift. His mind wandered to a time when his life had purpose and structure, a time when the uniform he wore brought him respect instead of disdain. He had served his country with pride, dedicating years of his life to protecting others. Memories of his comrades flooded his mind, their laughter, their camaraderie, and their unshakable bond in the face of adversity. But those days felt like a distant dream now, blurred by years of hardship. After his honorable discharge, Ethan had returned to civilian life only to find it unrecognizable. The job market was unforgiving, and his skills as a soldier seemed irrelevant to employers. His savings dwindled as he struggled to make ends meet. When his family grew tired of his failures and his friends stopped returning his calls, Ethan found himself utterly alone. He had fought for his country, yet no one seemed willing to fight for him. Ethan sighed, the sound barely audible over the din of the city. He took a tentative sip of the coffee, savoring its warmth despite its bitter taste. For a moment, it felt as though the world had paused, granting him a fleeting sense of solace. That moment was shattered by the sound of the cafe's back door slamming open. Ethan looked up to see a man storming toward him, his face twisted in irritation. The man was the cafe's manager, and his presence immediately set Ethan on edge. "You can't sit here," the manager barked, his voice sharp and uncompromising. "You're loitering, and it's bad for business." Ethan raised his hand slightly in a gesture of peace. "I'm not causing any trouble," he said quietly, his voice hoarse from disuse. The manager wasn't interested in explanations. "I've had complaints," he snapped. "Move along, or I'll call the police." Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but thought better of it. He had learned the hard way that people like this weren't interested in his story. They saw only what they wanted to see: a homeless man, a nuisance, someone to be removed. True to his word, the manager pulled out his phone and dialed. Ethan sat motionless as the call was made, resigned to the inevitable. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air, and 2 police officers arrived. "Sir, we've been called about a trespassing complaint," one of the officers said, his tone professional but detached. Ethan nodded. "I'll go," he said simply, standing slowly to his feet. His joints protested with sharp, stabbing pains, a cruel reminder of his age and the toll his life had taken on his body. The officers escorted him to their car, their expressions unreadable. At the station, Ethan was processed with cold efficiency. He was handed a court date and told to leave. There was no inquiry about his circumstances, no offer of help, just another bureaucratic procedure to endure. As he stepped out of the station and into the darkening evening, Ethan felt the weight of his reality pressing down on him. His feet carried him aimlessly through the streets, the crumpled court papers stuffed into the pocket of his coat. The city's lights blurred around him, their brilliance mocking the dull, colorless existence he had come to know. He eventually found a quiet corner near an abandoned lot and sank to the ground. His coat offered little protection from the cold, but he pulled it tightly around himself anyway, as though it might shield him from more than just the wind. Ethan looked up at the stars, their faint light barely visible against the city's glow. He wondered if anyone cared about him, if anyone even remembered the man he used to be. Once he had been a soldier, a protector, a hero in the eyes of some. Now he was nothing more than a shadow, a forgotten veteran lost in the cracks of society. The coffee cup, now empty, lay on its side beside him. It had been a small gesture, a fleeting kindness, but it wasn't enough to hold back the tide of despair that threatened to overwhelm him. Ethan closed his eyes and let exhaustion take him, his breath fogging in the cool night air. Somewhere in the city, life went on, indifferent to the man who had given everything and received nothing in return. The morning of Ethan Carter's court date arrived with a biting chill in the air. He stood outside the courthouse, his hands trembling as much from the cold as from the weight of his situation. His only possessions were stuffed into a worn military duffel bag slung over his shoulder, its faded insignia a stark reminder of the life he once led. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with activity. Lawyers hurried past, their briefcases in hand, while clerks shuffled through papers, calling out case numbers. Ethan shuffled through the crowd, feeling out of place in his tattered coat and scuffed boots. He avoided eye contact, his gaze fixed on the polished marble floor beneath his feet. When his name was called, Ethan hesitated before stepping into the courtroom. The space felt vast and imposing, its high ceilings and heavy wooden furniture designed to evoke authority and order. At the front of the room, the judge sat behind an elevated bench, her expression stern but not unkind. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and Ethan stood along with everyone else as the judge entered. Once seated, the judge glanced down at the file before her. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice steady and authoritative, "you're here today on charges of trespassing. How do you plead?" Ethan cleared his throat, his voice rasping from years of neglect. "Guilty, Your Honor," he said, his words barely above a whisper. The judge studied him for a moment, her gaze sharp yet curious. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Ethan hesitated, clutching the strap of his duffel bag like a lifeline. He had spent the night before preparing himself for this moment, though he wasn't sure his words would make any difference. Slowly, he stepped forward, his boots echoing on the polished floor. "Your Honor," he began, his voice cracking, "I never meant to cause any trouble. I was just looking for a place to sit, to stay warm. It wasn't about trespassing. It was about surviving." The courtroom fell silent as Ethan continued. He spoke of his time in the military, of the years he had spent serving his country in war-torn regions. He described the camaraderie of his unit, the missions they undertook, and the sacrifices they made. "I came back thinking I'd find a life waiting for me," Ethan said, his voice growing steadier as he shared his story. "But instead, I found a world that had moved on without me. No one tells you how hard it is to go from a soldier to a civilian. I tried to find work, but no one wanted to hire a broken-down veteran. I lost everything, my savings, my home, my family." The judge's expression softened as Ethan spoke, her pen still in her hand but no longer moving. Around the courtroom, the few spectators sat riveted, their earlier indifference replaced by a quiet reverence. Even the bailiff, who had seen countless cases pass through these doors, seemed moved by Ethan's words. Ethan took a deep breath, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I even sold my Medal of Honor," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "It was the only thing of value I had left, and I needed the money just to eat. That medal meant everything to me, but I gave it up because survival doesn't care about pride or honor." At those words, the judge visibly stiffened, her lips parting slightly as if she had been struck by a sudden realization. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied Ethan's face more closely. "What did you say your name was again?" she asked, her tone now laced with a hint of urgency. "Ethan Carter, Your Honor," he replied, puzzled by her question. The judge's gaze shifted to her clerk, who handed her a folder. She flipped through its contents, then looked back at Ethan with an expression that was no longer merely professional. It was personal. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "were you deployed in the Gulf War?" Ethan nodded, uncertain where this was leading. "Yes, ma'am. I served 2 tours." The judge's voice softened, and a flicker of emotion crossed her face. "Do you remember saving a young medic who was trapped during an ambush in 1991? You risked your life to pull him out." Ethan blinked, the memory flooding back like a tidal wave. "Yes, I do. His name was Eric Holloway." The judge's composure broke for a moment, and she pressed her hand to her mouth. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. Eric Holloway was my brother. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Ethan stood frozen, his mind reeling. The judge continued, her eyes shining with unshed tears. My brother told me about the soldier who saved his life, how you braved enemy fire to drag him to safety. He said he owed everything to you. I never thought I'd meet you like this. Ethan looked down, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his emotions. I was just doing my duty, he murmured. The judge straightened, her tone firm but compassionate. Mr. Carter, this court owes you more than a verdict. It owes you justice. She turned to the clerk. The charges against Mr. Carter are dismissed, effective immediately. The courtroom erupted into murmurs of astonishment, but the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, she continued, I will personally ensure that Mr. Carter receives the assistance he deserves. We cannot call ourselves a just society if we allow our heroes to be forgotten. Ethan stared at her, his throat tightening with gratitude and disbelief. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not as a homeless man or a trespasser, but as a person who had once made a difference. As he left the courtroom, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. Ethan didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he dared to hope. Ethan Carter sat in a small, sparsely furnished room provided by a local shelter. The room was quiet, save for the occasional sound of footsteps in the hallway. He stared at the beige walls, unsure how to process the whirlwind of events from the courtroom. The judge's unexpected connection to his past had not only cleared his charges, but also sparked a glimmer of hope that things might finally change. A knock at the door broke the silence. Ethan stood and opened it to find a young woman with a warm smile. She introduced herself as Catherine Monroe, a journalist for a prominent newspaper. Catherine's eyes were alight with curiosity and compassion, and she carried a notepad and a recorder in one hand. Mr. Carter, I've been following your story since the courtroom, she said, stepping inside after his hesitant invitation. I'd like to interview you if that's okay. People need to hear what you've been through. Ethan was reluctant at first, wary of being exploited or misrepresented. But something about Catherine's earnest demeanor softened his defenses. With a deep breath, he nodded and began to tell his story once again, this time in more detail. Catherine listened intently, her pen moving furiously as Ethan described his military service, the camaraderie he once shared with his unit, and the horrors of war that left scars invisible to the naked eye. He spoke of his return to civilian life, the jobs he couldn't keep because the memories of combat haunted his nights and drained his days. He explained how he lost his home, his family, and finally, the Medal of Honor he had cherished. When he finished, Catherine's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Ethan, she said softly, your story is one of resilience and sacrifice. People need to know how society has failed someone like you. I promise to tell it with the respect it deserves. Over the next few days, Catherine poured her heart into crafting the article. She titled it, The Forgotten Hero, How Ethan Carter Saved Lives and Was Abandoned by Society. The piece was raw, honest, and unflinching. She painted a vivid picture of Ethan's bravery on the battlefield and juxtaposed it with the neglect he faced upon returning home. When the article was published, it spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was shared thousands of times on social media, sparking an outcry. People were outraged that a man who had given so much for his country could be left to fend for himself on the streets. The hashtag Forgotten Hero began trending, with users demanding better care for veterans. Ethan's quiet life at the shelter was abruptly disrupted. Journalists from other outlets reached out, eager to cover his story. Local news stations aired segments highlighting his plight, often replaying Catherine's most striking line. How can a nation that prides itself on honoring its heroes allow them to fade into obscurity? Donations poured into veteran assistance programs, many with notes explicitly mentioning Ethan as their inspiration. Letters and packages began arriving at the shelter, addressed to Ethan Carter. Some contained heartfelt messages of gratitude, while others offered financial support, clothing, or even job opportunities. At first, Ethan was overwhelmed by the attention. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and the sudden kindness from strangers felt almost foreign. But as the days passed, he began to see the outpouring of support as something more profound than charity. It was recognition. One evening, as Ethan sat on his bed reading a letter from a retired Marine who had faced similar struggles, Catherine returned to the shelter. She was brimming with excitement. "Ethan, you've inspired something incredible," she said, holding up her phone. "Veterans and their families are organizing rallies across the country. They're demanding systemic changes to how we treat our soldiers when they come home. This isn't just about you anymore. It's becoming a movement." Ethan listened, stunned. He had spent years feeling invisible, yet now his story was igniting a fire in others. The following day, Ethan agreed to appear on a local news program. He was nervous as he sat in front of the camera, but Catherine's reassuring presence helped steady him. During the interview, he spoke not only of his own experiences, but also of the countless other veterans who were still struggling in silence. "This isn't just my story," Ethan said, his voice firm but tinged with emotion. "It's the story of thousands of men and women who served this country and were forgotten. If my voice can help bring about change, then I'll keep speaking." The interview aired that evening and was shared widely. Messages flooded in from veterans and their families, thanking Ethan for giving a voice to their struggles. As the movement gained momentum, a group of local volunteers reached out to Ethan, offering to help him transition into temporary housing that was more private and comfortable. Grateful, he accepted, moving into a small but clean apartment. One day, as Ethan unpacked his belongings, he found an old photograph tucked into a pocket of his duffel bag. It was a picture of his unit, taken during a rare moment of levity between missions. He stared at it for a long time, the faces of his comrades reminding him of the strength he once drew from their bond. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. Not just for himself, but for the possibility that his story might prevent others from enduring the same hardships. As the sun set outside his window, Ethan sat at the small table in his apartment, the photograph propped against a cup of coffee. His journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't walking it alone. The buzz surrounding Ethan Carter's story had transformed from local intrigue to a national phenomenon. Every major news outlet was now covering the plight of America's forgotten veterans, using Ethan's journey as a rallying cry. The #ForgottenHero was no longer just a trending topic. It was a banner under which veterans and their supporters across the country were uniting. Ethan, still adjusting to life in his modest new apartment, found himself at the center of a growing movement. Veterans organizations began reaching out, inviting him to speak at events and share his story. At first, he hesitated. Public speaking wasn't something he had ever imagined himself doing. But Catherine Monroe, the journalist who had given his story wings, encouraged him. "Ethan, this isn't just about you anymore," she said one afternoon over coffee at a diner near his new place. "You've become a symbol of something much bigger. People are listening, and they need someone to lead this charge. You can be that person." Though reluctant, Ethan agreed to attend his first public event, a rally organized by a coalition of veteran support groups in the city's main park. The turnout was overwhelming. Hundreds of people gathered, waving signs that read, "Support our heroes," and "No soldier left behind." Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder with civilians, united in their call for change. When it was Ethan's turn to speak, he stepped up to the microphone, his hands trembling slightly. The crowd quieted, their attention laser-focused on the man who had become the face of their cause. "I never thought I'd be here," Ethan began, his voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through him. "For years, I felt invisible. I thought my story didn't matter, that no one cared about what happened to me after I came home. But standing here today, seeing all of you, I realize I was wrong." He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. Some were tear-streaked, others resolute. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. Every man and woman who put on that uniform and came back to a world that didn't know what to do with us. It's about the families who've struggled to support their loved ones. It's about a system that needs to do better. And together, we can make that happen." The crowd erupted into applause, chants of "Ethan! Ethan!" filling the air. For the first time, Ethan felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of purpose. The rally marked the beginning of a series of events held across the country. Catherine's article had sparked a national conversation, but it was Ethan's presence and authenticity that gave the movement its heart. He began traveling to other cities, meeting with veterans, community leaders, and policymakers. At each stop, Ethan heard stories that mirrored his own. Veterans who had been unable to find work, who struggled with mental health issues, or who had been abandoned by a system that promised to support them. These stories fueled his determination to keep fighting, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been overlooked and forgotten. Meanwhile, donations to veteran support programs surged. Nonprofits used the funds to expand their services, offering everything from temporary housing and job training to mental health counseling. One organization even started a fund to help veterans reclaim lost military medals, inspired by Ethan's story of selling his Medal of Honor to survive. Ethan's efforts began to catch the attention of political leaders. Lawmakers who had previously ignored the issue of veteran homelessness were now scrambling to draft legislation aimed at addressing systemic failures. Several bills were introduced in Congress, including one that proposed increasing funding for veteran housing, and another that sought to streamline access to health care for former service members. Through it all, Catherine remained by Ethan's side, documenting the movement's progress. She wrote follow-up articles that delved deeper into the systemic issues facing veterans, each one as powerful and thought-provoking as the last. Her work ensured that the momentum continued to build. One evening, Ethan returned to his apartment after a long day of meetings and interviews. As he sat down to eat a simple meal, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a video clip from a rally in Washington, D.C., where thousands of people had gathered on the steps of the Capitol. In the video, a young woman held a sign that read, "Ethan Carter inspired me to fight for my dad." She spoke into a microphone, her voice quivering with emotion. "My father served in Iraq, and when he came home, he was a shadow of the man I remembered. He struggled for years, and we felt so alone. But Ethan's story showed us we're not alone. It gave us hope, and it reminded us that we deserve to be heard." Ethan watched the clip twice, his chest tightening with a mix of pride and sorrow. He had never set out to inspire a movement, but the fact that his story was making a difference filled him with a deep sense of responsibility. The next day, Ethan received a call from a woman named Linda Morgan, the founder of a grassroots organization that worked to house homeless veterans. She invited him to visit one of their shelters and meet the people who had benefited from the surge in donations. At the shelter, Ethan met a man named Luis, a former Marine who had been living on the streets for years before finding refuge through Linda's organization. Luis clasped Ethan's hand tightly, his voice thick with gratitude. "You gave me my life back," he said. "I didn't think anyone cared, but you proved me wrong." Moments like these reminded Ethan why he had chosen to share his story in the first place. The movement wasn't just about policy changes or viral hashtags. It was about restoring dignity and hope to people who had given so much of themselves. As the weeks turned into months, the movement showed no signs of slowing down. Ethan became a reluctant but effective leader, his authenticity and humility resonating with people from all walks of life. What had started as one man's story had grown into a nationwide call to action, proving that even in the face of neglect and adversity, change was possible when people came together. Ethan Carter's story had become a lightning rod for change, reaching every corner of the nation. Newspapers carried headlines about the veteran movement daily, and social media remained abuzz with discussions. Through the tireless efforts of activists, journalists, and lawmakers, the movement's impact had become undeniable. Then, one crisp autumn morning, Ethan received an unexpected letter. It arrived in a heavy, cream-colored envelope bearing the seal of the United States government. The return address read, "The White House." Ethan stared at the envelope for a long time before carefully opening it. Inside was a formal invitation to meet the president at a special ceremony honoring veterans. His hands trembled as he read the letter, which commended him for his service and his role in raising awareness about the plight of homeless veterans. The weight of the invitation sank in as Ethan sat down on the edge of his bed. For years, he had been invisible, a man ignored by the very system he once served. And now, the president himself wanted to meet him. When Catherine Monroe heard the news, she was ecstatic. "Ethan, this is incredible," she exclaimed over the phone. "Do you realize what this means? Your story has reached the highest office in the land. This is an opportunity to push for real, lasting change." Ethan wasn't sure what to expect from the ceremony, but he agreed to go, knowing how much it could mean for the movement. Over the next week, Catherine and a team of volunteers helped him prepare. A local tailor offered to make him a suit free of charge, and several organizations pooled resources to ensure his travel and accommodations were covered. On the day of the event, Ethan stood in front of a mirror, adjusting his tie. The suit fit perfectly, and for the first time in years, he felt like a version of himself he had almost forgotten. As he looked at his reflection, he thought about his fellow veterans, the ones still struggling, still unseen. This moment wasn't just about him, it was about them. The journey to Washington, D.C. was surreal. Ethan had never been to the nation's capital, and as he approached the White House gates, he was struck by the grandeur of it all. Secret Service agents guided him through security, and he was ushered into a waiting room where other honorees, veterans from various branches of the military, gathered. A staff member briefed them on the ceremony's agenda, and soon they were escorted into the East Room, where an audience of government officials, military leaders, and invited guests awaited. Cameras flashed as Ethan entered, and he felt the weight of every eye in the room. The president took the stage, his demeanor warm yet commanding. He began his speech by acknowledging the contributions and sacrifices of America's veterans. "Today, we are here to honor not only the bravery displayed on the battlefield, but also the resilience shown in the face of adversity," the president said. "One man's story has reminded us all of the urgent need to do better for those who served. Ethan Carter, your courage both in service and in life has inspired a nation." Ethan's name drew applause, and he felt his chest tighten with emotion. As the president continued, Ethan's mind wandered to the people who had helped him reach this moment. The judge who had recognized him in court, Catherine, who had shared his story, and the countless strangers whose support had carried him through. Finally, the president turned toward Ethan and gestured for him to step forward. A hush fell over the room as Ethan approached, the weight of the moment nearly overwhelming. "Ethan Carter," the president began, holding a small box in his hands. "For your extraordinary service to this country and the bravery you displayed on the battlefield, it is my honor to reissue the Medal of Honor you sacrificed for survival. This medal represents not only your heroism, but also the gratitude of a nation that has finally recognized its responsibility to you and your fellow veterans." As the president placed the medal around Ethan's neck, applause erupted. Ethan blinked back tears, his hands shaking as he touched the medal's cool surface. It wasn't just a piece of metal, it was a symbol of redemption, acknowledgement, and hope. When the applause died down, Ethan stepped to the microphone. He hesitated, his voice catching as he began. "I don't have the words to describe what this moment means to me," he said. "For years I felt forgotten. But today, standing here, I see that change is possible. This medal isn't just for me. It's for every veteran who has struggled, for every family who has felt abandoned, and for every person who believes we can do better." The room rose to its feet in a standing ovation, and Ethan felt an overwhelming mix of pride and humility. After the ceremony, Ethan was approached by military leaders, policymakers, and advocates, all eager to discuss how they could work together to continue the momentum of the movement. He spoke with senators about proposed legislation, shared ideas with nonprofit leaders, and even took a moment to pose for photos with young cadets who viewed him as a hero. That evening, Ethan returned to his hotel room, exhausted but filled with a renewed sense of purpose. As he sat on the bed, the medal still hanging around his neck, he thought about how far he had come and how much further he had to go. The ceremony had been a turning point, but it wasn't the end of the fight. If anything, it was just the beginning of a new chapter. Ethan was no longer just a forgotten veteran. He was a voice for change, a beacon of hope, and a symbol of resilience. The ceremony at the White House had left Ethan Carter in awe, but it also came with a responsibility he couldn't ignore. With the Medal of Honor once again resting against his chest, he knew his story had become a symbol for something far greater than himself. Yet, Even as his presence gained national recognition, he wrestled with the weight of his newfound role. The morning after the ceremony, Ethan found himself standing in front of a crowd of reporters gathered just outside his hotel. Microphones were thrust toward him, cameras clicked incessantly, and questions flew from every direction. "Mr. Carter, how does it feel to receive your Medal of Honor again? What message do you have for veterans who feel forgotten? What's next for you, Ethan?" The onslaught of attention was overwhelming. But Ethan took a deep breath and leaned into the moment. "This medal isn't just for me," he said, his voice steady despite the sea of eyes watching him. "It's for every veteran who's been left behind. It's a reminder that we need to do better. Not tomorrow, not someday, but now. And I plan to do everything in my power to make sure that happens." The impromptu press conference only amplified the momentum of the movement. Later that day, Ethan was invited to meet with members of Congress to discuss legislative changes aimed at improving support for veterans. Accompanied by Catherine Monroe, who had become both his confidant and his greatest advocate, Ethan entered the Capitol building with a mix of determination and nerves. Inside, they met with lawmakers from both parties who were eager to hear his perspective. Ethan shared his personal experiences, emphasizing the systemic failures that had led to his years of homelessness. He spoke about the need for better mental health care, affordable housing, and job training programs for veterans. One senator, visibly moved by Ethan's testimony, promised to champion a bill aimed at streamlining access to VA benefits. "Your story has put a face to an issue many of us have overlooked for far too long," she said. "Thank you for reminding us of our duty to those who served." As Ethan left the meeting, Catherine couldn't hide her excitement. "Ethan, this is huge," she said. "You're not just telling your story. You're changing the narrative for every veteran out there." While policy discussions continued in Washington, Ethan returned to his hometown, where he was met with a hero's welcome. A parade had been organized in his honor, and the streets were lined with people waving American flags and holding signs that read, "Welcome home, Ethan," and "Thank you for your service." As the parade made its way through the town, Ethan rode in the back of a convertible, waving to the crowd. Children ran alongside the car, veterans saluted him from the sidewalks, and strangers shouted words of gratitude. It was a surreal experience, one that brought tears to his eyes. At the end of the parade, Ethan was invited to speak at a community gathering in the town square. Standing before his neighbors, many of whom he hadn't seen in years, he took a moment to gather his thoughts. "I never imagined this day would come," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "For so long, I felt like I didn't matter, like my service and my struggles had been forgotten. But today, I see that's not true. Your support, your kindness, and your belief in me have shown me that we can make a difference. Together, we can ensure that no veteran ever feels invisible again." The crowd erupted into applause, and Ethan was embraced by people who shared their own stories of service and sacrifice. Among them was a young man who introduced himself as a recently returned Marine. "Mr. Carter," the man said, his voice steady but emotional, "your story gave me hope. I've been struggling to adjust since I came home, but knowing what you've overcome makes me believe I can do it too." Moments like these fueled Ethan's resolve. He spent the following weeks traveling to other towns, meeting with veterans and their families, and attending events organized to raise awareness about the challenges they faced. At every stop, he encountered people whose lives had been touched by his journey, people who saw in him a reflection of their own struggles and a reason to keep fighting. One evening, Ethan received a call from Linda Morgan, the founder of a grassroots organization for homeless veterans. She invited him to visit their shelter, which had been greatly expanded thanks to the surge in donations inspired by his story. When Ethan arrived, he was greeted by a group of veterans who had found refuge there. They shared stories of how the shelter had given them a second chance, stories of hope, resilience, and newfound purpose. One man, who introduced himself as Frank, approached Ethan with tears in his eyes. "Ethan," Frank said, his voice trembling, "if it weren't for you, I don't think I'd be here today. You reminded me, and the world, that we matter." That night, Ethan sat with the veterans around a fire pit in the shelter's courtyard. They swapped stories about their service, laughed over shared memories, and found solace in each other's company. For Ethan, it was a reminder of the bond that existed among those who had served, a bond that transcended time, rank, and circumstance. As the evening wore on, Ethan gazed up at the stars, his Medal of Honor glinting faintly in the firelight. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the hardships, the heartbreak, and the unexpected twists of fate. He wasn't just a forgotten veteran anymore. He was a hero honored, a voice for change, and a symbol of what could be achieved when people came together for a common cause. And while the road ahead was still long, Ethan knew he wasn't walking it alone. The fire that had ignited with Ethan Carter's medal ceremony continued to burn brighter as his story spread. The national outcry for better care and support for veterans was growing, but change, as anyone who had fought for it knew, didn't happen overnight. Ethan's name had become synonymous with the cause, and now the next chapter was unfolding in a way no one could have anticipated. Catherine Monroe, who had stood by Ethan since the day he'd shared his story in court, had an idea, a powerful one. If Ethan's story could shake the nation, then maybe the stories of other veterans, the ones still languishing in silence, could ignite even greater change. She pitched the idea of a documentary that would chronicle not only Ethan's transformation, but the broader issue of homelessness among veterans. It would give a face to the statistics, allow viewers to see the human cost of a system failing those who had fought for their country. At first, Ethan was hesitant. He had spent years living under the radar, unseen, and the thought of reopening his wounds for a camera was intimidating. But after a long conversation with Catherine, who had become not just a journalist, but a friend, he realized this was another opportunity, an opportunity to reach even more people, to speak for the veterans who had no voice. He agreed. Filming began in earnest a few weeks after his return from Washington. The crew followed Ethan as he revisited the places that had defined his fall into homelessness: street corners, shelters, and the dark alleyways where he'd once sought refuge. They interviewed other veterans, too, some who had found their way out of despair, others still trapped by it. Their stories were raw, unfiltered, and heartbreaking, but they were also filled with an undeniable resilience that could not be ignored. One veteran, a former Marine named Dave, sat with Ethan in a small room of a halfway house, his weathered face lined with the years of struggle. "You know," Dave said quietly, his hands trembling as he spoke, "I got lost in all the paperwork. VA claims, appointments, people telling me I'm not sick enough, not injured enough. I'm a Marine. I'm supposed to be tough. But they don't see what we go through when we come home. The scars that don't show. It eats you alive." As Dave spoke, Ethan listened intently, his eyes focused on the man who had shared his fate for so long. They had both worn the uniform, both returned to a country that had turned its back on them. And here they were, together, finding strength in their shared pain. The documentary crew also filmed Ethan as he returned to the shelter he had once called home, now transformed into a beacon of hope for many others. He spoke to the men and women there, some of whom had been veterans for decades, others who were newly arrived. "What you're seeing here," Ethan told the camera, "is what's possible when we stop forgetting about our brothers and sisters in arms. The change is slow, but it's happening. And that's why we need to keep pushing, to keep fighting, not just for ourselves, but for those who will come after us." The documentary, titled The Forgotten Heroes: A Journey of Resilience, began to take shape over the next few months. The filmmakers carefully edited hours of footage, weaving together interviews, footage from the streets, and powerful moments of transformation. They captured the depth of the veterans' experiences, the haunting reality of their struggles, and the undeniable strength of their will to survive. It was a heart-wrenching, eye-opening look into the lives of those who had served, those who had been left behind. When the documentary was finally released, the impact was immediate. It premiered at a special event held in Washington, D.C., attended by lawmakers, military leaders, journalists, and veterans. Ethan was there, as was Catherine, who had helped guide the project from concept to completion. The screening was followed by a panel discussion that featured Ethan and several of the veterans who had been featured in the film. The room was packed with reporters, politicians, and veterans advocates, all eager to hear from those who had lived the story the documentary told. The response was overwhelming. Viewers were glued to their screens as they watched Ethan, once a forgotten veteran living in the shadows, now standing in front of the nation as a symbol of courage and determination. The stories of his fellow veterans, men and women who had fought for their country only to return to a world that seemed indifferent to their suffering, moved viewers to tears. Social media exploded with hashtags like "Veterans Deserve Better" and "Honor Our Heroes," urging people to take action. Within days, the documentary went viral, reaching millions of viewers across the country. Local news outlets ran feature stories about the film, and major networks began to cover the growing veteran movement. Political leaders on both sides of the aisle started to take notice, and the conversation about veterans' care moved from the fringes of political discourse to the center stage. In the wake of the documentary's success, donations flooded into veteran organizations, and new partnerships were formed to address the growing crisis of homelessness among veterans. Several cities, inspired by the film, began implementing policies aimed at reducing veteran homelessness, including increasing funding for housing programs and mental health care. The Department of Veterans Affairs, which had been widely criticized for its inefficiency, was forced to respond, promising a comprehensive review of its practices. But even as the movement gained national attention, Ethan knew that the fight wasn't over. The film had sparked a conversation, yes, but it was only the beginning. His role as a spokesperson for the movement was far from finished. He continued to travel the country, speaking at rallies, attending legislative hearings, and meeting with veterans who needed help. His story, and the stories of those who shared his struggles, had ignited a fire that couldn't be extinguished. One night, after a long day of interviews and speeches, Ethan sat alone in his hotel room, looking at the framed picture of his medal on the wall. The words from the documentary echoed in his mind. This is what happens when we stop ignoring the people who gave everything for us. As the sun set outside his window, casting a warm glow over the city, Ethan knew that this fight would not end with the documentary's release. It would continue until every veteran had a home, until every person who had served could walk with their head held high, free from the shame of being forgotten. The road ahead was still long, but with every step, Ethan was building a legacy that would endure, a legacy of change, of hope, and most importantly, of a nation finally living up to the promises it had made to its heroes. The weight of Ethan Carter's journey had shifted from the heavy burden of survival to the hopeful promise of a new life. But rebuilding wasn't as simple as moving into a new apartment or getting new clothes. For Ethan, the process had just begun. The documentary's success had catapulted him into the spotlight, but with that came both opportunities and challenges. The world had seen his strength, but only he knew the depth of the scars left by the years of trauma and neglect. It would take time, patience, and perseverance to rebuild not just his life, but his sense of self. A few weeks after the documentary aired, Ethan found himself standing in front of a small, one-bedroom apartment in a newly renovated building in downtown Richmond. The walls were a neutral beige, the floors hardwood, and the place was furnished simply but comfortably. He had moved in with the help of the donations that had poured in after his story went viral. Donations that had been directed toward helping veterans like him. He had a roof over his head now, but the echoes of his past, the ghosts of forgotten years, still loomed large. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he unpacked a box of photos, military mementos, and books. The framed photograph of his Medal of Honor, a symbol of sacrifice, sat on the mantel, a constant reminder of everything he had endured and overcome. But even as he stood there, placing items carefully on the shelves, Ethan could sense a new kind of hope stirring within him. For the first time in years, he wasn't just living day to day, hoping for survival. He was thinking about the future, about what it might hold. His first week in the apartment was a mix of triumph and isolation. Though he was no longer homeless, he felt a disconnect, a distance from the life he had once known. The people around him, some of whom were excited to see him starting fresh, couldn't fully understand the depth of his struggle. His friends, the ones who had supported him from afar, were thrilled but unsure of how to help him now. They all saw him as a hero, a symbol of resilience, but Ethan still saw himself as the same man who had once scoured alleyways for food, the man who had lost everything and was only now beginning to find himself again. During this time, he received countless letters, cards, and messages of support from strangers, fellow veterans, and advocates. Some of these were filled with gratitude for his courage, while others shared painful stories of their own struggles. There were letters from families of veterans who had died alone, unseen by a nation that had promised to care for them. Each letter, each message, served as a reminder that his fight for change was far from over. But there were also messages from those who had been inspired by his story to seek help, veterans who were no longer willing to live in silence, who now had the courage to step forward. One such message came from Frank, the Marine he had met at the shelter. Frank had found a part-time job at a local restaurant and was starting to turn his life around. "Ethan," Frank wrote in his letter, "if it wasn't for you, I don't think I'd be here today. You gave me hope when I had none. Now I'm paying it forward, helping other vets who are where I was. I'll never forget you, man. Thank you for showing me that we can all rebuild, one step at a time." Reading Frank's letter brought a lump to Ethan's throat. It was moments like these, moments of connection, of seeing someone else break free from the same cycle of despair, that reminded him of why he had agreed to share his story in the first place. This was why he had fought for his voice to be heard. But for all the support he received, there were still the quiet nights. Evenings when the shadows of his past crept in, when the memories of the war and the years on the streets threatened to consume him once again. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't instantaneous. Healing, like rebuilding a life, was a process, one that required patience, forgiveness, and the willingness to face the things that had once been buried. Ethan began attending therapy, something he had never truly considered before. For years, he had buried his feelings, convinced that a man like him didn't need help. But the weight of his experiences, the horrors of war, the isolation, the betrayal, had worn him down. He needed to confront those demons if he was ever going to move forward. The first few therapy sessions were painful. Each session peeled back layers of guilt and grief that Ethan had spent years trying to hide. He spoke of the friends he had lost in battle, of the times he had felt completely alone, even when surrounded by fellow soldiers. He spoke of the shame he had felt when he couldn't find work, when he was forced to sell his belongings just to survive, when he had to swallow his pride and accept help from strangers. But it was during one particular session, as he recounted the feeling of being invisible to society, that Ethan finally began to understand something crucial. He had spent so long convincing himself that his worth was tied to his past accomplishments, to the medal around his neck, to the victories he had fought for in war. But what he realized in that moment was that his worth was not just in what he had done, but in who he was. A man who had survived, who had endured, and who was determined to give back to others. With each session, Ethan began to rebuild not only his life, but his sense of self. He started to explore his interests, things he had long neglected: painting, writing, even playing guitar again. Small hobbies became avenues for personal growth. He began volunteering with local veterans groups, working as an advocate for those who still found themselves on the streets, as he once had been. His story of struggle and survival became the cornerstone of his efforts to inspire others to rebuild their own lives, to show them that it was never too late to start again. But the real turning point came when Ethan found a job offer waiting for him one morning. It was from a nonprofit organization that helped veterans transition back into civilian life. They had seen his work with the community and were eager to offer him a position as a peer counselor, someone who could guide and support veterans who were struggling with the same issues he had faced. It wasn't just a job. It was an opportunity to make a difference. Ethan accepted the position, knowing that this was his next step, his way of giving back to the veterans who had become his family. He had learned that a life wasn't just rebuilt with walls and possessions. It was rebuilt with purpose, with meaning, and with the connections he forged along the way. His first day on the job was nerve-wracking, but as he sat across from a young veteran who reminded him of himself, Ethan felt a sense of peace wash over him. He could help this man. He could show him the way, just as he had been shown. He could offer the same hope that had been offered to him. And as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Ethan realized that the life he had once thought was lost was, in fact, just beginning. Ethan Carter had come a long way since the days of begging for scraps in dark alleys, forgotten by a society that had once promised to honor his service. Now, as he settled into his role as a peer counselor at the Veterans Organization, he had begun to truly understand the weight of his new identity, not just as a survivor, but as a beacon of hope for others who were still lost in the shadows. He had seen firsthand the pain and despair that so many veterans carried with them, but he had also seen something else, the flicker of hope, however faint, that could be reignited with a little support, a little understanding. Ethan's work at the nonprofit had become his calling. Every day, he met with men and women who had served their country, only to return to a world that didn't seem to care. Many had never received the help they needed, whether it was mental health care, housing, or simple recognition. And like Ethan, they had often found themselves slipping through the cracks of a system designed to protect them. But when Ethan spoke to them, when he shared his own story of struggle and redemption, they listened. They saw in him not just a counselor, but someone who truly understood. His story wasn't just about hardship. It was about resilience, about rebuilding, and about refusing to give up. He had lived through it, and now, through his work, he was helping others find the strength to do the same. One day, after a particularly intense session with a group of veterans, one of the younger men, a former Army sniper named Jake, pulled Ethan aside. Jake had been silent for most of the session, his eyes downcast, but something about the way Ethan had shared his struggles seemed to stir something in him. "Ethan," Jake said, his voice rough, "I don't know how you do it, how you keep going after everything you've been through. I've been trying to hold it together, but I feel like I'm losing it. It's hard to believe things will ever get better." Ethan looked at Jake, seeing the same hopelessness in his eyes that he had once carried within himself. But now, with time and reflection, Ethan could see beyond the despair. He knew the path Jake was walking, and he also knew that it was the small steps, the everyday choices, that would lead him out of the darkness. "You're not alone, Jake," Ethan said softly, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "I've been where you are. Hell, I've lived it. But I'm telling you, it does get better, one day at a time. You just have to take it step by step. You have to let people in, let them help you, because that's the only way to move forward. It won't be easy, but nothing worth fighting for ever is." Jake nodded slowly, the weight of Ethan's words sinking in. Ethan could see the change in him, the flicker of hope beginning to shine through the clouds of doubt. And it was in that moment that Ethan realized the true power of his own story. It wasn't just a tale of survival. It was a story that could light the way for others, that could guide them through their own dark times. And that, more than anything, was what kept him going. Word of Ethan's work spread beyond the walls of the nonprofit organization. Local media outlets picked up on his involvement with the veterans community, and soon he was being invited to speak at rallies, veterans events, and even community forums. He spoke passionately about the need for systemic change, about the importance of addressing the mental health crisis among veterans, and about the need for better access to housing and job training. His words resonated with people, not because he was a politician or an expert, but because he was one of them. A man who had been forgotten, but who had fought his way back to the light. Ethan's face had become recognizable, not just in his local community, but across the country. His journey, from the depths of homelessness to being a national symbol of resilience, had inspired a movement. Donations to veterans organizations had surged, and more people were rallying behind the cause, demanding that the government provide better care for those who had served. But even as he gained recognition, Ethan remained grounded. He knew that the real work was in the lives he touched every day, the veterans he helped one-on-one. His work with Jake and others was just as important as the speeches and interviews. In fact, sometimes it felt even more meaningful, because those small moments, the quiet victories, were the ones that made the biggest difference. At one of the rallies Ethan spoke at, he was introduced by a congresswoman who had been a longtime advocate for veterans' rights. Her name was Linda Gray, and she had heard about Ethan's story after the documentary had gone viral. She had been moved by his resilience and had invited him to speak at a nationwide veterans advocacy event. Ladies and gentlemen, Congresswoman Gray began. I'd like to introduce you to a man who embodies the very spirit of this country. A man who, despite being cast aside by the system he fought for, refused to stay down. He is no longer a forgotten veteran. He is a leader, an advocate, and a symbol of hope for all of us. Please welcome Ethan Carter. As Ethan stepped up to the podium, the crowd erupted into applause. The cheers were deafening, but to Ethan, it felt surreal. This was the same man who had once been dismissed, ignored, and abandoned. Now he was standing in front of thousands, speaking not just for himself, but for every veteran who had ever felt overlooked. He cleared his throat, his heart pounding in his chest. The words he had prepared for this moment seemed inadequate, but he knew he had to speak from the heart. I don't stand here as a hero, he began, his voice strong yet humble. I stand here as a man who was given a second chance. A second chance not just to live, but to serve again. And let me tell you something. Every veteran deserves that chance. Every one of us who has given so much for this country deserves to be seen, to be heard, and to be helped. We are not invisible. We are not forgotten. The crowd was silent now, hanging on his every word. I've been where many of you are. I've slept on the streets. I've lost my hope. But I'm telling you this, there is a way out. Together, we can rebuild, not just our lives, but our community. We can create a world where veterans are valued, where they have access to the care they need, where they don't have to fight for a roof over their heads. The applause erupted again, louder this time, and Ethan felt a swell of emotion rise within him. This was his purpose. This was why he had gone through everything he had, so that he could help others find their way out of the darkness. After the rally, Ethan was swarmed by reporters, but he knew that the real work was just beginning. His story, now immortalized in the hearts of so many, had sparked a movement, but it was up to all of them to carry it forward. As Ethan walked through the crowd, he saw the faces of veterans, of families, of advocates, all united in a cause that was bigger than any one individual. And in that moment, he understood that he was no longer just a symbol. He was part of something far greater than himself. He was a catalyst for change, and together they would make sure that no veteran, no matter their struggle, would ever be forgotten again. Ethan Carter sat in the quiet of his new apartment, his eyes drawn to the gleaming Medal of Honor displayed on the shelf. It was a symbol of everything he had once been, of the man who had fought for his country with honor and bravery. But now, it represented something more, the man he had become after everything had been taken from him and he had fought his way back. The apartment, though modest, was a sanctuary. It was a far cry from the dark, cold streets where he had once wandered, searching for a place to belong. The walls were adorned with photos from his time in the military, each image telling a story of camaraderie and sacrifice. On the coffee table sat a framed picture of the veterans' rally he had spoken at just a few months ago. His face now recognized across the nation as a symbol of resilience. But even as he sat in his newfound peace, his thoughts often drifted back to the days when he had felt lost, abandoned by the very country he had sworn to protect. He still couldn't fully grasp how much his life had changed in such a short time. From the cold corners of homelessness to being celebrated in a White House ceremony, it felt like a dream he was afraid to wake up from. But then, every time his fingers brushed against the Medal of Honor, the reality set in. He had earned this moment. He had earned this new life. Ethan wasn't alone in his journey. The veterans organization where he had first started working had become his second family. The bonds he had formed with other veterans, those who had shared the same struggles, the same battles, were unbreakable. Every time he helped another man or woman navigate the broken system, it was a reminder of why he couldn't stop fighting. For every person he helped, there were dozens more who still needed a voice, still needed someone to stand beside them. One of the most fulfilling moments of his journey had come when he reconnected with his old military comrades. After years of isolation, he had finally been able to call them again, and the joy in their voices as they greeted him was enough to make all the years of struggle worthwhile. They had stood by him during the hardest parts of his life, sometimes only in spirit, but it had been enough to keep him going. But there were still days when Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of lingering doubt. Even as he addressed rally after rally, speaking on behalf of the veterans who still didn't have the recognition they deserved, there was a part of him that wondered whether it would ever be enough. The system was broken, and even with all the attention he had garnered, the fight was far from over. The money that poured into veteran assistance programs, though vital, was only a temporary fix to a deeper problem, an issue that ran far beyond bureaucracy and red tape. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Ethan sat alone in his apartment, staring out the window at the city lights. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking his concentration. It was a text from Jake, the young veteran he had helped months ago. Jake had been one of the first to show the faintest glimmer of hope when Ethan first met him. Now, Ethan considered him one of his closest friends. Jake, hey man, I just wanted to thank you again. I've been thinking a lot about what you said that day, and I'm finally starting to get my life together. Got a job offer today at a local warehouse, and I'm actually looking forward to it. Feels crazy to be talking about a job again, you know? Ethan smiled as he read the message, the weight of the words sinking in. He had spent so many years fighting for himself, but it was moments like this, when he saw someone else take the first step toward rebuilding their life, that made everything worth it. He replied quickly, his fingers flying over the keys. Ethan, you've got this, Jake. I knew you had it in you. This is just the beginning. Let's catch up soon. Putting the phone down, Ethan leaned back in his chair, feeling the exhaustion of the day wash over him. But it was a different kind of tiredness now, a kind that came from giving everything to a cause, knowing that every step he took brought change, no matter how small. He had given so much, but it felt like it was only the beginning. The door to his apartment creaked open, and for a moment, Ethan wondered if he was imagining it. But then, his eyes landed on the figure standing in the doorway. It was Linda Gray, the congresswoman who had been a driving force behind the veterans movement that had taken off after his viral interview. She had become a close ally in his fight for systemic change. Her work in Congress had made a real impact, pushing through legislation that offered more funding for mental health programs and job training for veterans. But she had also become something more, a trusted friend, a reminder that even in the fight for justice, there were people who cared enough to stand by him. Ethan, Linda said softly, her voice tinged with an unmistakable warmth. I've been thinking about you. You've done so much for everyone, and I know you're not the type to rest, but I just wanted to remind you that you don't have to do it all alone. You've made a difference in more lives than you know. Ethan stood up, his chest tight with emotion. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear those words until now. I know, he said, his voice thick with gratitude. I guess I'm still figuring out what comes next. There's so much work to do. It's hard to know where to begin sometimes. Linda smiled, stepping closer. You've already started, Ethan. You've inspired so many people, not just with your words, but with your actions. You've given them a reason to believe in themselves again. That's more than most people will ever accomplish in a lifetime. Ethan nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. He had spent so long focusing on the fight, on the work that needed to be done, that he had forgotten the simple truth. It wasn't just about the end goal. It was about the lives he had touched along the way. It was about the people he had helped to stand back up. Linda placed a hand on his shoulder, and for a moment they stood in silence together, two allies bound by a shared vision of a better world for veterans. Ethan finally allowed himself to feel the weight of all he had accomplished, not as a man who had overcome, but as a man who had changed the world in his own way. He had fought for a second chance, and now, in the quiet of his apartment, surrounded by the faces of those who had supported him, he realized that he had found it. And it was not just for himself. It was for all the forgotten heroes who had come before him, and for those who would follow. The story of Ethan Carter wasn't just one of survival. It was a story of redemption, of hope, and of a future that was being rebuilt, one life at a time. And that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across the streets that had once been his prison, Ethan Carter stood at the window of his apartment, watching the world unfold below. The chaos, the noise, the relentless push of life. It had all been part of the story he had left behind. But now, he had a new story to write. One where the chapters weren't defined by hardship alone, but by the strength he had found in the most unexpected places. His journey had not been easy, nor had it been short. There had been moments of darkness, of desperation, and of fear. But every step had been a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. And as Ethan looked out at the horizon, he realized something that had eluded him for so long. He was not just a survivor. He was a part of something bigger. He was a symbol of change, a symbol that no matter how forgotten or broken a person might seem, they still had the power to rewrite their story. His phone buzzed on the table. It was another message from a fellow veteran, someone who had been through the same struggles and had found hope in Ethan's journey. With a smile, Ethan picked up the phone, his fingers typing out a quick response. "Ethan, it's never too late to begin again." And with that, he closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the past lift as he embraced the promise of tomorrow. A tomorrow that was no longer defined by the scars of the past, but by the potential of the future. For the first time in years, Ethan Carter felt truly at peace. The battle had been long, but the victory was sweet. And now, as a new chapter began, he was ready to face it with courage, hope, and the knowledge that even the most broken can rise again. Thank you so much for joining us and listening to Ethan's incredible journey. We truly appreciate you taking the time to follow along with this story and witness the transformation from hardship to hope. Your support means the world to us. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss out on more inspiring tales. Your feedback is always welcome, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on Ethan's story. Stay tuned for more content, and thank you once again for being a part of this journey with us. Until next time.